So next up, we have Liz Horn. She's co-principal investigator at Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Data Network, and I'll let her go ahead and get into her story. She was here yesterday, going for the data, and we're going to continue it today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and I should have grabbed the slide advancer. Oh, great, awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know it's the last session, and we've had a wonderful 2 days together, but I know it's been a long 2 days, so I hope you'll find this session helpful. I'm Liz Horn. I'm a scientist by training. I'm a cancer biologist. I also have a degree in informatics, and I've spent most of my professional career working with patient advocacy groups, building registries and biobanks, and really helping to bridge that gap between academic researchers and advocacy organizations and really moving research forward. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is just sort of a high-level things to think about, trying to give you some practical tips and some tools. This isn't easy. If it were easy, everyone would be doing it. And not only is it not easy, it becomes more challenging to do it well. But I always say you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and you have to start somewhere. So I'm hoping this will give you all a starting place and empower you, because everybody can do this. But again, it's just not easy. So I have a quick question. I wanted to sort of do a poll with the room. How many of you have a registry? Great. Well, so I would say in any format. Yes, and that was a wonderful comment, because there are many, many different kinds of registries, and there are many different options, and depending on what you're trying to do, you might choose a different option. And again, if you were in my talks yesterday, there's no wrong answer, and that's what makes it so complicated. So we have groups that have registries. Of those that have some form of a registry, how many of you want to enhance it, improve it, do more than you're already doing? Good. How many of you are interested in starting a registry and are trying to figure out where to start? Great. And then in terms of biobanks and biosamples, is there any interest in those? Okay, great. So the way I've kind of structured this, and I've done these where I've given a whole day deep dive session on this, and we have 45 minutes, so it's going to be at a little bit higher level, but it'll help get you the tools to start asking the right questions. So we all hold a piece of the puzzle. Our individual experiences are relevant and they're meaningful, and together we can put these pieces to the puzzle together to tell the whole story. But we need everyone's pieces of the puzzle, and especially in a rare disease, the more information we have, the more it's going to tell us. And if you can have 50% of the people with a condition in your registry, if you can have more, it's going to tell a much more complete story. And I think something that I don't have to remind this audience, but patients and families are really important data sources. They're really motivated participants. Patients and families have an expertise that clinicians don't have, because patients and families have the lived experience of living with the disease. And clinicians, they see lots of different people with lots of different conditions, and they don't have, they'll take a history, they'll ask questions, but there's a real expertise. And I think patient-reported outcomes, and we need a better word for them because I don't like that word, patient-reported outcomes, but they're vital, because really we have the best information about ourselves. So part of it is trying to figure out how to ask the questions the right way so we can give this really rich information. And registries are so important. They're important to all stakeholders. Researchers need the data. Industry, we need to find people with a condition to have clinical trials. It's important to regulatory and government agencies. So this is a really, really important area, and I think it's wonderful that you're all interested in it and you've started somewhere, and there's always a lot of opportunity to grow. So why do we want to do this together as a group instead of doing individual one-off collections? So when we do things individually, there's fragmentation. it can get really expensive because in some ways you're doing it multiple times and you're reinventing the wheel. Very often, if it's in a researcher's lab, that researcher or institution controls the collection. There may not be sharing to the level that people want. And again, it can be really redundant, and there can be a limited ability to compare. So when we can do a centralized resource, which is what many advocacy organizations are doing, I trip over that every single time. It's a nemesis. If we do something in a centralized way, and many advocacy organizations have started their own registries, it can eliminate a bottleneck for data and samples because the motivation of the advocacy organization is to share. The cost can come down, and when you have data, not only are you helping the researchers you already know, but you have the ability to attract new researchers to their own field, to your field. And a lot of them come with their own funding, and that is awesome. And when we have a collection where many people can access it, many researchers, we have this ability to compare across studies. We can do validation with the same data and samples, and you can really have consistent quality. So I could talk about this for hours, but I really think that it makes a lot of sense for advocacy organizations to be involved in building these. There are many, many success stories of doing it, and I think it helps us get to the answers faster. So what I'm breaking this up into 5 sections where I'm going to talk about some planning considerations, some considerations about vendors, and that's really, the vendor piece is really important because we all can't do this on our own, and we have to work with partners. And in some, oh, sorry. I'm like, what? Sorry. Sorry. We have to work with partners. I hope they edit that out. We have to work with partners because we can't do it on our own. And so sometimes I'll use the word vendor, sometimes I'll use the word partner. Depending on the relationship, it might be a little bit different. But there is going to be someone that will house your software, that will house your samples, that will do these things. I have some considerations for biobanks, some considerations for registries. These could really be in either order. I think just went alphabetical. And then finally, what are your expectations and your organization's expectations? Because that's something really important to think about, and to think about it kind of at the beginning. What do you want to get out of that? And it really helps you build something that will meet your needs, but it will also lead to satisfaction, and it will also give buy-in from your board and your community. So I think because we're generally talking to the leadership of organizations here, the expectation piece I think is underappreciated, but it's really important. So it's really important to plan because you want to ask the questions ahead of time. What am I trying to do? What kind of registry do I need to build? And you need to solicit input. You need to talk to people that have built registries, what's worked, what hasn't worked. And you need to talk to your researchers and find out what they need and how they need it. So they may need a specific piece of data or sample, but there might be some nuance to that. Whenever I'm building a biobank collection, I get very granular and I say, okay, if I collect the blood this way and process it this way, can you still do your experiment? Because what you don't want to happen is to put all this time and resources into it and get to the end and they say, oh, well, you used a purple top tube to collect that blood and I can't use it. So I think getting really granular with people, and you're not going to be able to be everything to everyone, but just understanding what do people need. And then you define those goals based on those needs. So for some groups, having a contact registry is really what you need at the time. Some people need some groups need more information about their disease, some basic, maybe some clinical history, symptoms, especially for newer diseases. We need to follow people over time to understand the progression, because with a newer disease, you don't have the collective history of it. So again, once you know what your needs are, you can help define your goals, and then you can figure out what you need to build. And you should really consider a prospective collection. So prospective collection means that I'm going to enroll you and I'm going to follow you over time, and we're going to start here, and then we're going to take this journey together. And you can, it's a really helpful way to follow people over time. And then you can also add, if you're not ready for biobank, you can always add that in later, and you don't need to do everything now. One thing that where you need to sort of solicit some additional input and expertise is around the consent language, because you really want to make sure that it doesn't preclude future use of the samples and future, or the data and future use of sharing. So I have an example, and people don't write consents like this anymore, but it was very, very granular. This was a government project. It said that the samples were going to be stored in this specific room, in this specific building, in this freezer, and then they had to move everything because they weren't using that building anymore. And it caused so much red tape because they couldn't just move the samples because they were so specific in the protocol. So it's kind of a fine art of providing enough information for the IRB that they're comfortable, but not painting yourself into the corner with super specific language. And we had some really nice conversations about consent yesterday, and I know Sage has developed a tool, and they've developed a toolkit with Global Genes and there might be some in the back of the room, but I know there are some in room 4, but there's some really good information in there. And you'll need to develop a business plan. And we were in the organizational talks this morning that Mary Cobb and Jean Campbell gave, and they really were talking about the importance of planning. And when you do a registry or a biobank, it kind of is like a small little business. So you need to really develop that plan. And I believe that my 5 Ps, proper planning prevents poor performance. So you really can't overplan, but at the same time, you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So what are you going to collect? How will your data or samples be collected? And again, lots of different options here. Will you have an online questionnaire that people will fill out? Will people need to go into a clinic to see a physician and answer the questionnaire there? How and where will the data and samples be stored? Who's going to manage the collection? Who are the people that are going to be involved in the day-to-day? And then also, who are the people that are going to be involved in the governance and the decision-making? Who can access the collection? That's really, really important. Understanding who is access, who determines access, and being transparent about that. Who's going to advise you? And I saw on a slide yesterday, and I loved this, that everyone has a bias. And when you're dealing with all of your advisors, everyone has a bias. And that's just the way life is, but you're going to have to filter that out. So get advice from multiple advisors. And what kind of resource considerations do you need? And especially, I think the human resource piece is very underappreciated. If you're going to be following up with a lot of families, who's going to do that? Follow-up takes a lot of time. How will you follow up? And really, how much money do you have, financial considerations, and how big do you want to build this? I mean, not everyone needs a Cadillac registry. We can do a lot of really, really good things with smaller, simpler registries, and everyone doesn't need to build their own, and there are some resources out there that are quite cost effective and very low cost to the organization. And sometimes there's no cost, but there's still always going to be a human resource cost. So even if it says, there's no dollars expended, it's not exactly free because your time isn't free. But I think knowing what you want and what your expectations, and especially with some of these that are at lower cost, you have less control of how data are used. And again, it's all trade-offs. There's not a right answer, there's not a wrong answer, but finding the place where you're comfortable. And I gave a talk yesterday at the beginning of session 2 about kind of questions to figure out your comfort level. And I know all the slides will be available, and that might be something that would be helpful to look at. So what activities should be done in-house and what should we outsource? We can actually outsource a lot of this. I'm running a study right now. It's a biobanking study where we're collecting at clinical sites, and we're going to be adding a registry component probably in the next year or so. And I live in Portland, Oregon, and I'm running the study pretty much from my kitchen, but none of the stuff is there. So I need a lot of vendors to help me. So where can we outsource things. So in terms of biorepository services, you can get people that can build you kits, they can process and store your samples. You can have companies that have registry and data services. Some are more expensive than others. Different ones allow different amounts of customization. And for some groups, customization is really, really important, and for others, it's not. So again, there's really no right or wrong answer here. It's just making sure you're working with solutions that meet your needs. So that's why it's important to know what your needs are. There are people that can help you with operations. There are people that can help you with professional services. There are people that do this for a living. There are fee-for-service IRBs or commercial IRBs that you can use. Two of the really good ones are Western IRB and Chesapeake. Right now, I have a couple projects with Chesapeake, and these are all available to people regardless of whether you're at an academic institution or not. So, yeah? Oh, Institutional Review Board. So they review studies, and I don't know if you had a chance to go to the consent one yesterday because there's so many good talks here. Meg Dorr did a really nice job of talking about why we need IRBs, but the short answer is a lot of people have done studies that haven't really been ethical, and one of the big ones was the Tuskegee syphilis study where they followed these. They told the participants that they would be receiving treatment for syphilis, and they followed them over time without treating them. And this ended in 1974 because of a whistleblower, and it went on from like the 40s. It's crazy. Anyway, and there's a lot of examples of poor research conduct, so unfortunately that's why we have IRBs. And I think that in some ways they can seem a little burdensome, but really I've found that they tend to be really easy to work with, and if you have any questions about IRBs, you can always just email me, because they really are your friends and your partners. Recruitment and retention, in terms of how are you going to let people know about your registry, how are you going to get them into the system, how are you going to retain them, that often takes a lot of back and forth, interaction, ways to ask questions. Will you have volunteers to help you with this? Will you have a key group of people from your organization that will serve as ambassadors? There are a lot of different options. Marketing and advertising, and again, most groups will be marketing and marketing to their own community, but then also marketing to others, to pharmaceutical industries, to other partners, to let them know that you have this really wonderful resource. And then there are definitely ways to outsource financial and fundraising. Lots of different people that can be your vendors and your partners. They can be commercial vendors. You can work with companies. A lot of times academic core facilities can help you. You may bring in consultants to help you with this, working with IRBs. There are clinical research service organizations. And so again, a lot of different options. And you can also even use interns and work studies to help you with some of this. So there are a lot of different ways to build this, and a lot of different ways to get help. So you don't have to do it all by yourself, but at the same time, you have to really know what you're trying to do. So when you go towards these vendors to say, okay, I know I want to do this, I need to find people to help me, you really need to talk to them. Interview them, attend webinars, do site visits if you can. Do they have similar clients? Do their similar clients like them? Are they good partners? I think that rare disease is a very unique space. Each rare disease is obviously very different, but there are some common themes that are similar in rare diseases. And I think having vendors that understand the unique landscape of rare diseases can be quite helpful. Talk to current and former clients. Find out how much customization is available within the system. Sometimes you can customize things a lot, add lots of specific questions, and sometimes you can't. And it depends what's important to you, what's important to your organization, what you're trying to do. And then consider the differences between commercial and academic vendors. And I kind of use the term vendor loosely here, vendor or partner. Very often when you're doing something ownership's important. So if you are paying a company for it, a lot of times you get to own it. If you're working with academia, academia owns it. And in some cases, that's not a problem, but I just think people just really need to understand who ultimately owns the data and the samples and who makes the decisions. And with any vendor, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So you're going to talk to people, you're going to get your different bids, and I would just say, very often, we've done RFAs where we've said, okay, we're looking for a vendor to do X, and we get these bids back, and we've asked them all the same questions, but it really is like apples and oranges, and sometimes it's like apples and elephants. I mean, they're so different. They're responding to the same questions, but they're really, really hard to compare across. So make sure you understand their terminology, what they mean by something. Are there any minimum requirements? What regulatory and compliance measures do they meet? And if they're meeting some of these, then you don't have to worry about it. And the contract terms should be very clear. They should be understandable. I think it's a disservice to all of us when contracts are so complicated you have to hire a lawyer to understand it. No offense to lawyers in the audience, but I just feel that if we're signing something, we should understand it. It just shouldn't be in legalese. And make sure that there are clear terms if you want to break it and if not renewing the contract. And what happens if the vendor goes out of business? Or what happens if the lab where this resource is doesn't have funding? What happens to the assets? And if you're going to do it yourself or build it yourself, don't forget, even if you have someone that says, oh, I know how to do this, don't forget about the human capital, about the FTE, because again, nothing is ever free. So if you're looking for a vendor, and I've actually, this is someone else's slide. This is from Patient Crossroads, but I really like Kyle Brown's slide because I think it has some really key points. So you want to focus on vendors that know patient registries, and especially patient registries for rare diseases. You don't want this to be a side business for them, because if it's a side business, it's not going to be something that's a focus or important. You want scalable approaches so you can start quickly and you can grow. And what's great is there are a lot of scalable approaches out there. So this talk that I'm giving today is really different than when I would have given it like 7 or 8 years ago. So that's really, really exciting. And you want to work with vendors that have been there, that have done that know rare diseases, that understand some of the unique challenges of smaller foundations. Can advise on best practice, are focused on technology and security, because we really, in today's day and age, we really can't guarantee that all data are secure. Everyone does their best to protect privacy, but at the end of the day, we really can't be guaranteed. Can the vendor provide registry staff if needed? Do they have expertise in working with a centralized IRB? Do they know how to navigate this system? Do they have a roadmap that they can help you just, it's like a checklist. Jean was talking about her checklist this morning. It's a checklist. Can they help you fill it out, check it off? And has a long-term sustainable business model. I think with technology, there are always new companies that are coming, and not all of them survive. And sometimes, I've had groups that said, oh, we get to be the beta group for this. Isn't this awesome? Well, it's great, but then what happens if they are not there? So in the long term. So those are just things to think about. And this is one of my favorite cartoons. This is really about software development, but it's all about building a swing. And it's so important that everyone is on the same page about what you want, what the user asked for, and you can see it's like a little one bar, how the analyst saw it, how the system was designed, how the programmer wrote it, and again, this is not looking anything like what the user originally asked for it, what they really wanted, and then how it actually works today. And I think that you can't have enough conversations with the people that you're working with on this, and we do a lot of things virtually these days that I think are fantastic, but face-to-face and even, just Google Plus or Google Hangout to Google Hangout where you're actually seeing the person, I think that can really, really help. because you don't want to be in this situation, and unfortunately happens more often than we'd like to admit. So if you are thinking about a biobank, there's a lot to think about. So some of it is based on the collection. So what kind of samples do you need? Who do you need them from? How often do you need to collect samples? Is it enough to just collect blood once? Do you need to collect it over time? What are the logistics? How will that actually happen? Where will it be collected? When will it be collected? Who's going to collect it and how often? Now, the great thing is there are a lot of ways that we can be creative about collecting samples. We can send kits to people's houses. They can then go to a blood draw center. We can also send phlebotomists to their house to collect the blood. We can do this at an event. I mean, a lot of organizations will do a biosample collection at their conference because everyone is kind of in the same place. So there are a lot of options, but you just have to think through the logistics. And are there similar collections or similar groups who have done something like this? What did they do? What worked? What didn't work? And how do you move forward? Processing and storage, where will it be located? How do you need to aliquot it? What do you need to store? And again, talking to your scientists about what they need will help you answer these questions. There are a lot of good vendors out there that you can use. People that make biobanking their business have a lot of rigor that sometimes you may not see in academic labs, and that's just because when it's your business, you have to have all of these SOPs and follow all of these things. But again, there are a lot of good collections in academic labs. So access, who can access it? Who determines access? What are the protocols for someone determining access? Is there an application process? Do you have a committee that reviews it? How will you distribute these samples? And then is there a cost recovery model? I mean, biobanks are expensive, and I think it's very reasonable to ask researchers to pay a nominal fee for samples to help keep up with the infrastructure. And unfortunately, when things are free, people don't appreciate it, which I think is, it's unfortunate, but it's just sort of reality. And what's the governance? Who will steward the collection? Who's really looking out for those samples? And in many cases, that's the advocacy organization. And will you be returning results? And again, this piece can get really detailed, and it requires a lot of thought, but it's really, really time well spent. Our registry considerations are quite similar. And many biobanks, they have a registry component. So what medical information is being collected, and you can have basic information like demographics, lifestyle, and we're starting to get more and more complex family history, genetic information, diagnosis and treatment information. And who's going to enter this information? Will it be the participants? Will it be families? Will it be something that's online? How will that all work? And as you're building your questionnaire, this is something where getting insight from multiple stakeholders can be really helpful, working with your medical advisory boards, working with people that actually know the best way to design questionnaires. And this is my example from yesterday. I was working with a group, their medical advisor, really, really great guy, world-renowned expert on the disease, wanted to ask a question, do you have kidney or liver disease? So if I say yes, do I have kidney disease? Do I have liver disease? Do I have both? And so he knew the right questions to ask, but he didn't know how to ask the question. So that's where we were like, okay, well, let's break this into 2 questions, and worked with him. And it worked out really well. But I think that when you're working with people to help you design questionnaires, ask them how much experience they have in designing questionnaires and in data analysis, because it really makes a difference. Where do you get your information? How can we use standards? So if there are standardized instruments for your disease, it's really great to use them. A lot of diseases don't have standardized instruments that are validated, so that's a challenge. But you can use questions others have used, and here are some examples where there are question banks. And really by using similar things, it helps us to compare across collections, to pool data, and really to start to look across a larger picture of the data. And all of these issues we had with the biobanks about access, who ownership, who determines it, governance and stewardship, we have those as well with the registry. And this piece is always really, really important. So what are your expectations? What are your expectations of what will happen with your samples and your data? Do you want to share it with providers? Do you want to help families? You know, is this a natural history study? Are you trying to get ready for the FDA? And all of these, the expectations of what happens with your samples and your data, that helps you figure out how to design your collection. And then I think that getting everyone, the leadership of your organization, kind of on the same page is really, really important as well. How do we as a group expect this information to be handled? What do we expect to do with it? And expectations are quite important. And I'm leaving a lot of time for questions because I know that that's where we get really into the meat of this, and I can help answer what you really want to know, which may or may not have been in any of these slides. But I think that it's really important to not duplicate efforts. Now, sometimes there are different collections that do different things, but they're not the same. So I think that as long as you're not duplicating, but if you have different goals and different focuses, that's completely fine. You really need to develop partnerships to share data, to share samples and resources, and ensure that your resource is sustainable over time. Follow best practices, and there are a lot of groups that have best practices and standards that you can use. And I think that if you are collecting biospecimens, having annotated data with it is really, really important. Because if we just have a sample and we don't know anything about the person that sample came from, that's not very meaningful. And I think it's also even more meaningful to collect data over time. So if you are collecting data with the sample, you're taking a picture and it's a snapshot, but we know life's not a snapshot, we know life's a movie. So the more touch points we can have, I think the more useful that data will be over time. Use common data elements and controlled vocabulary, work with people that know how to build questionnaires. And there are a lot of nerds out there that love to be asked. Like, we love it when you say, "Can you look at my questionnaire?" What? Hey, I'm proud of it. No, I'm one of us. But no, but really, there are a lot of people that love to share their knowledge. They want to help people. Especially people that don't work in the rare disease space, they tend to be, they're very excited about the passion that comes along with it, and they want to help. They want to help you, and they want to make sure that you're going on the right path. So ask people, say, "Hey, can you look at my questionnaire?" And you know, you're going to get different opinions, so that sometimes makes it difficult, but it never hurts to ask. And be transparent about your processes, especially to your researchers. How do people access data? What's the process? Because sometimes, and different fields are different, but some fields are really, really competitive, and the researchers don't really like each other. And so I worked on a project once where the samples were in this one researcher's lab called Researcher A. Researcher B was convinced that Researcher A was going into her freezer in the middle of the night and running experiments without telling Researcher B. And I was like, I think she has better things to do with her time. But I think that when you can be really transparent about the process, it helps. And being open will help build trust. And I think, too, you know, research is really competitive, and we've set up, we exist in a system that the competitive piece is rewarded and sharing is not rewarded. So you're changing the paradigm when you're telling them, you're going to give information back to us, you're going to share your data, this is how we're going to do this, and if you want to play in the sandbox, these are the rules. So I think, so by being transparent about all of this, it helps, and you'll bring them along. You know, they might be a little unsure at first, but generally they come along. And good partners are essential. And you know, you need you need to be working with people that are good partners, and talk to other people that have done this. Everyone, it's always a learning process, and anytime you build one of these, when you think about it at the end, there are probably things you would have done differently, and there's a lot of shared experience in the community. So talk to people, find out what worked, find out what didn't work, and you can't really overplan. And I think the other thing that I always I give talks like this also to researchers and scientists, but I also like to just reiterate that people really matter. We're doing this because of the people, because we want to have better lives for our families, for our loved ones, and that's, we're not doing research just to do research, and that's why we're all here. So just always putting people at the center. So I finished with a lot of time on purpose, and I want to hear from you about what you need, where your questions are, where your pain points are.
What do you recommend for an organization that's got a registry that's patient-driven, patient-owned, that needs to be elevated? So it's a basic questionnaire that touches all of the symptoms that are identified by the families and by the specialists, but it's just a questionnaire at this stage. And moving it forward towards a natural history study is our goal.
So I want to congratulate you on having a questionnaire that asks about the symptoms and in the specific disease areas, because that's really important in all these multi-system diseases, and that's a really important first step. Natural history studies are hard, and people throw around the word natural history study a lot, and some of them that use that word don't really know what one is. So if you're going to be doing a natural history study, make sure that the clinicians and the people you're working with, they know how to do natural history studies, which is great, because a lot of, but what I would recommend is, so you're basically going to need to do a deep dive on each of the sections of your registry. You're going to need to convene some experts to help develop specific questionnaires about the symptoms. And I think what you can do is you get medical volunteers, you have conference calls with them. SurveyMonkey is great to ask people questions and have them respond. And there's a free version of it that, when you're sending things to researchers, and it's not as labor intensive as it would have been doing this, 10 years ago. It's funny, I just did one where I was doing an inclusion-exclusion criteria with my researchers, and I kept saying, are you comfortable? Their choices were, yes, I'm comfortable. No, I have major problems with this statement. And we kind of did this iteration several times with these little surveys that they could just do anywhere, and we got to an inclusion-exclusion criteria without getting everyone on the phone. So I think finding a core group of people to work with, and it's probably going to take you 3 to 6 months to build out where you need to go. And I would also say, talk to the people that want to use the data. What are they really looking for? And the fact that you're getting parent input, what are the important symptoms? I think that's really, really underappreciated, because when you have a lived experience with something, you know things that others wouldn't, and sometimes you might not even, it might be something that you don't realize is important. So I think having that parent input is essential. So it's a process, but you're really on the right way to do it.
So one of our concerns of building a database and picking a vendor is, I'd make an analogy to my cable company, that they come in and they give you this pricing, and then over the next year the pricing goes up and the pricing goes up and the needs go up, and so pretty soon you can't afford it anymore, and you don't have the rights to it because you agreed. And so I feel like you almost need an attorney that's sitting there talking about, you're either going to cap my pricing, or if it gets to the point and company B comes over here and now I want to be able to transfer that data at any point in time over into another vendor that can store it and access it and process it more cost effective for the organization. Do you guys have access? Trying to find legal counsel in this environment to be knowledgeable in rare disease and these type of things, almost impossible.
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces of so you have those points are all really well taken. I think when you are using a vendor, I think it is reasonable to consider an incremental increase every year on pricing. For one of my biorepository vendors, it's 3 to 5%, and so I've built that into my budget that I know it's going to increase. In terms of with a software vendor, I think you want to understand like what you're getting for those increases. Are you getting continual updates to the platform? Does this keep their it's them keeping their business sustainable, giving you the updates, moving it forward. And I think one of the questions for a lot of groups is, do you want to pay for a service like this? Because there are some options that are pretty low cost or are free, but then you have much less control of where the data go. And so like Patient Crossroads, for example, on their Connect platform, they have public Connect, but they're the ones that are creating the questionnaire. They're the ones that are deciding where the data go.
Your registry, and they will also allow you to do custom questionnaires. I'm with Patient Crossroads, so I'm way deep into their product.
Yeah, and we are too, but so when you say customization, there's really a lot of different levels of customization. So it's having that conversation with the vendor. What does that mean? And what are your expectations of customization? Because different expectations could be very different. We have a different service with them that there's a lot of customization. And when you move from one vendor to another, it's really tough because then you have to map data. Mapping data is really, really expensive. And in some cases, see, mapping data is very, very expensive. He's a software person, computer person. And so sometimes it's hard to move data into a different registry. So I think another thing is asking clients of the vendor, how long have they been with the vendor? Do they like it? How has the experience been? And I think definitely you want to work with the contracting piece is hard. And there are people that will do pro bono contract review. A lot of boards have either someone on the board is an attorney, or there may be a family member that has an attorney, and they're always a good place to start. But when you really get like deep into the IP piece, it gets challenging. And what I did, so I needed a contract lawyer. One thing that you can do is you can call the bar association in your state. I live in the state of Oregon, and my friend's dad is a former prosecutor, and he gave me this tip. But basically, I called the bar association and said, this is what I'm doing. Can you make any recommendations? And then they had a listing, sent me to some lawyers. And then when you're talking to that lawyer, even ask them, we're a very small nonprofit. Would you offer pro bono services? And a lot of them will. And sometimes, even if it's not completely free, they can still knock down the price. But I think having someone review that's going to be really important. What happens to that data? What happens if that data, if the company goes away? But it's really hard to move data from one system to another, at least right now.
Hi. We have a very successful 2,000-person congenital muscle disease registry. We have a biobank, we have a tissue repository. So we're kind of well into this. One of our gentle but persistent critiques has been we have a lot of scope creep. Under your expectation slide, you said, select what are the priorities. Is that to share with providers, help families move research forward, or appear in publications? We're trying to do all of that at once, and it's not working because we're not doing any of it very, very well. So 3 questions. First is how to avoid scope creep, how to prioritize. Second, do you feel like registry oversight by an IRB is important, just for the actual registry, not necessarily for clinical studies? And 3, how do you monetize a registry?
Those are excellent questions. And I wouldn't say, and while I definitely, I think scope creep is a good term, we're all trying to do everything, but we have limited resources. And if someone came in and said, here's $1 million, we could figure out how to do it all. But there's only so many hours in the day, so many people. So again, Don't beat yourself up over it. But the thing is, in some ways, and this is where your board can help, actually, sometimes the board, that's where some of this scope creep happens. So sometimes if you have a smaller committee, like a research committee or an oversight committee, and you can get some experts in the field or people that have expertise in some of the areas where you're working on to really help make that professional recommendation that we really need to focus. I think one way to help focus is to look at budget. How much money do you have to spend this year, and budget and man hours, and how many man hours, even if it's all volunteer, do you have to do it? And then work with your board to prioritize, because all of those things are really, really important, and sometimes we just can't do it all. And each group's prioritization is probably going to be different. So your prioritization might be different than my prioritization, and that's totally fine. But I think having those conversations, and I think really just saying to the board, look, this is what we have and this is what we can do. Where do we want to focus our efforts? And then what can we do next year? So I would say I'm always a big fan of having IRB approval, because then it gives a level of confidence and oversight to the people that you're going to be using the data. So everyone that works at an academic institution for all of their studies, they need either IRB approval or exemption, because that's just how academic medicine works. So when the investigator wants to use your data, and just because sometimes they're, oh, really? How did that happen? So sometimes when they want to use your data, so sometimes when you're in this space and they don't know you very well, just even saying, oh, here's my IRB protocol number, it just gives them confidence that you're doing things with high levels of rigor. So that is I think it's helpful. And then it allows more options with what you can do with the data. I ran into a real big pickle about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, where we had surveyed, and it was all like quality of life. It was just general surveys, and I was trying to publish it, and the journal wasn't going to take it. And they basically said, okay, I understand you did it as market research. We'll let you publish it this time, but if you try to submit this again, you need to get under an IRB. And I was like, okay. So sometimes that can affect how you can use it. Monetizing, it's easier to monetize sample than data. You'll never recover the true costs of this, but you can put some cost sharing into it. You can charge research. It's a little harder to charge for data because data can be more easily shared. But if you are having investigators, if you are working with investigators to either recruit for their studies, if you're helping them by pooling data, you can charge an administrative fee, because you need to pay for someone's time, even if it's your own time, to recover the time spent pooling all the information that they need.
Hi, I'm Steve Grossman, adcy5.org, and this was a great presentation because we're in the throes of trying to deal with this. And I guess one thing I'd like to throw out to the crowd is we've started to put together a requirements document, a spreadsheet, to try to analyze that. Nice. So if I'm going to plagiarize or borrow some of your things, and if anybody here has a business card or wants to get involved with that, well, let's talk, because we want to build a master spreadsheet so at least get you through the first level of analysis of the vendors out there. So if we're going to be doing that, let's work together and do that. So second question is...
And please give me your card, because we created a lot of those tools when I was at Genetic Alliance, and I want to make sure you have access to them. Okay,
great. But I guess the second thing is when you're dealing with complex data sets like genomic data, genomic files, microbiome data, high throughput drug assay results, what do you do? I mean, it's a lot of data to try to store, manage.
Yeah, so we're actually doing some of that with the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation, and the way that we've done that. So basically the short answer is we found a really good academic partner that's an informatics person, but is still giving us control of the data set. And I think, and that's actually worked really well, so we still have the same levels of control, but it is really, really hard, because with a lot of these vendors, they don't have the bandwidth to, or either they don't have the bandwidth or that's not their business model. So I think having some good academic partners, but you need to navigate that, and I'll be honest, we got lucky.
We're right at the end of the session, so maybe one quick question. You're just too popular with all your questions. Here you go.
I mean, really, we could spend the whole weekend. Like, we could order in pizza and still be here on Sunday.
On one of your slides, you had, it said types of information and who enters the information. So I have actually two questions. So the first one is, if you have families that are entering in that data through your database that they have to log in or password or whatever, how do you validate that?
Okay, so that's a really good question. There's a whole discipline of patient-reported outcomes, and the short answer is you pick questions that families are going to know the answers to. Okay. So you ask a question like, and I'm just going to do some basic health questions. Do you have high cholesterol? Yes or no? And not necessarily expect the families to know those numbers. The other thing that you can do is you can always have them go get their medical records and provide that, or their lab results. Again, depending on what it is. We're doing this with genetic tests because we really need to know exactly what the mutation is. And we found that when we ask our families what the mutation is, their interpretation doesn't necessarily match what's on the test. So you pick questions that they can be successful at. And PRISM has some really good questions. PROMISE has some good questions. And you test your questionnaires with your families. You have people practice and, hey, did you understand it? And when you start to get the data back, or not even like the test questionnaires, you'll be like, oh, wow, I was looking for this answer and I got something completely different, and then you know your question's not good. So I think it's just designing the questionnaire so people can be successful, and then having a document, like just even a PDF that says, okay, this is what we're asking, and this, because sometimes one sentence you need more.
Okay. And then my second part was, do you have a list, or can you supply a list with different vendors that create databases?
Yeah, so I would say that sort of top of line right now is Patient Crossroads. GRDR is still doing some work in this area. NORD has a registry. Genetic Alliance has PEER. I think those are all ones that are really worthy of exploring. But depending on what you're trying to do, different ones will be better fits for you. So having that understanding what you're really trying to collect, that's going to be key to helping to select some of these. And typically, the more expensive something is, well, expense versus free, the more control you have over it.